welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Claudia Strauss. She's Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Pitzer College. She's the author of Making Sense of Public Opinion and co-author of A Cognitive Theory of Cultural Meaning. And her newest book, available now, is called What Work Means: Beyond the Puritan Work Ethic. Claudia, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. And so in her book, Claudia wrote, one of the key points in this book is that when people speak of Americans' work ethic, that is their willingness to work hard, they can mean four things. Number one, working hard to be self-supporting, which I call working to live. Number two, working hard to afford a comfortable or affluent standard of living, which I term working to live well. Number three, willingly working long hours because work is central to one's identity and interests, which I call a living to work ethic. And number four, being a conscientious worker during regular work hours, which I term a diligent 9 to 5 work ethic. With the first and second work motivations, working to live and working to live well, the primary goal of working is to earn money. Working hard to support oneself or to live well is not what Max Weber meant when he wrote about the Protestant work ethic. For Weber, the Protestant work ethic made work a moral duty, hence an end to itself, hence an end to itself, end in itself. So what's so interesting is that when we think about work, I think especially in this country, in the United States, like it's pretty much divided up, right? So we have people who seem to, we're definitely going to get into polarization about this as well, but just to kind of briefly touch on it, we either get people who kind of hate work and equate it with with capitalism, and then we have kind of people who love work, and these are like the entrepreneurial types who kind of let's say glamorize or glorify capitalism, right? So can we kind of talk about what that's sort of like, and pretty much, can you actually give us a background in terms of why you started studying work, what's important about it to you, and then obviously then we'll get into the different types of, I guess, work modalities or work ethics.
Yeah, and I really want to address that dichotomy, those extremes, because
Yeah.
there's so many people in the middle. But to answer your question, how did I get into it? So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and in particular, I'm a psychological anthropologist, which means I'm really interested in the nexus between the personal and the societal, how those come together.
Yep.
And I was really interested in work as, something that's both important in American culture, as it is everywhere, but it's kind of takes on sometimes these mythic elements in American society, and of course in people's lives. So it was a really, it was a perfect topic for me. And also because I was starting my research following the Great Recession when a lot of people were out of work.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So they, when you're busy working, you're not thinking about it very much. When you're out of work and thinking about, what kind of job do I want next? And then the bigger questions, wait a minute, what's the place of work in my life? People become much more reflective. And
Yeah.
plus they had more time to talk to
Mhm.
you, so it was really a perfect topic for me.
Mhm. I love that.
No, for sure. I mean, I remember being out of work. I think it
Mm,
was for over a year. And at
mm,
first, okay, it felt great. I'm thinking, all right, I have all this time to kind of think about my life, reorient myself, think about what does it all mean? What's my purpose? Maybe I could then align myself with some kind of work that, feels congruent to my
mm.
identity and that sort of thing. But, as the time sort of goes on, and let's say you're not at that job yet, you haven't found that work, something kind of happens inside of you where you start thinking, oh man, I kind of miss working. Like I miss
Really?
kind of having some sort of a purpose, right? At least, when I had that sort of 9 to 5 routine, okay, I understood. This is that time to work, and then the rest of the time that's free, and I get some sort of a routine going. But without that, and kind of left to the chaos of it, again, at first it felt amazing. I could do whatever I wanted during the day, right? But then after a certain while, you just kind of feel like there's this lack of purpose, that if I guess you're not really proactive about, kind of orienting your day a certain way, like with a schedule, it can be disorienting. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I found with my interviewees. And a lot of them, I don't know what time period it was when you were out of work for that for a year, but a lot of my interviewees had been out of work for at least a year because
Mm.
it was a really bad job market following the Great Recession, which is hard to remember now. Things have really, the labor markets have really changed. At the time I was doing my research,
Mm.
there were 3 people looking for a job for every job opening. And now
Wow.
there's less than one person looking for a job for every job opening. So
Wow.
when we hear all those to say, when people say nobody wants to work anymore, that's not it. It's there are not enough workers. Um, but
Hmm.
people reported exactly what you were saying, and it got me thinking about, leisure is only leisure in relation to that routine of working. And I found these interesting different reactions to how people want to fill up their time or deal with their time. So, you started talking about those 4 different work ethics. One of them was that diligent 9 to 5 work ethic. So the people
Hmm.
with the diligent 9 to 5 work ethic, really tried to recreate that 9 to 5 routine.
Hmm.
So if you could like go to your local Starbucks at a certain fixed hour, and that's your office. That's like going to the office, right?
Hmm.
And even like they'll build in even working out, going to the gym. That's part of the routine. They sort of try to create a routine of going out, doing things, and then coming back home. And of course, if you're teleworking, you can sort of create that routine too. It's a little trickier, it's a little different. But
For sure. Yeah.
what's interesting, the people who had the living to work ethic, and I really want to dig into these, and I hope, we will, that
Yep.
Please.
they kind of filled up their time differently. It was sort of like if, and because they had always, when they were working, they used their time differently. The diligent 9 to 5 wanted kind of fixed boundaries
Mm.
between working, not work time and non-work time. The living to work were just willing to put as much time as necessary, 8 hour days, 10 hour days, 12-hour days, whatever it took, to get the job done. And I kind of felt with some of them, they talked about, well, not only were they applying to jobs, but they were going to all these optional networking events. And some of them were going to like 4 networking events a week,
Yep.
or coffee dates, to with people, getting to know people in their fields and making contacts. And so I sort of felt like they were trying to fill those very overly busy, very busy days like they used to have when they were working. People handled it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And so interesting because in psychoanalysis, there's a concept called moral masochism. And so when we think of moral masochism, people tend to usually just, it's a very kind of, at least the way I don't want to even call it a popular conception because most people don't know of it. But when it's usually thought of, the thinking is that this is like, it's a preoccupation with being a really, really good person. But what's so
Mm,
interesting with moral masochism is that also within it, we could put in work. And so people sometimes get confused. They're like, but wait, so when I talk to people about it, like other therapists or whatever, they're thinking like, wait, but that doesn't make sense. When we think of moral masochism, we think of like just being a good person. What the hell does working have to do with it? But yeah, so actually with moral masochism, it can actually be a drive for work. So obsessiveness, perfectionism. And so can we actually talk about that, right? How did or when did that happen that work became an actual facet of goodness and morality?
yeah. This is something I really want to talk about or think about because I found different attitudes about this. There was sort of a shared idea of being productive, the importance of productivism. Um, so in terms of when, there's a story that Max Weber tells. Okay, you alluded to Weber, about the when, and not everybody agrees with him.
Hmm.
But what he argues is that you got this shift in Europe around the 1600s.
Hmm.
So his argument, again, not everyone agrees, is that it used to be people had more like what I'm calling this diligent 9 to 5 work ethic. And you were just working to live, right?
Mhm.
You were just working to earn, to make enough to support yourself.
Hmm.
And then in his story, what happened is you got these sort of go-getters who were in a kind of strange twist. motivated by their Protestant beliefs. Because they had this very anxiety inducing form of Protestantism that you don't know if you've been saved. You don't know if God has chosen you to go to heaven after you die.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you might get some sense of that is if you're very successful in this world. If you're successful in your projects in this life, that shows you're in God's favor and you'll go to heaven after you die. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of working, instead of just making enough to meet their needs, working all the time. Okay. And then he actually argues, well, the whole religious element of it dropped out very quickly. That was not the most important thing, even starting the 1700s. But you had still, particularly people who were, we'd now say entrepreneurs, people, small business people, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who had their own business, were now taking work to be central in their lives, not just working to live, but it was beyond that. It took on this moral meaning.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a good person, right? Unless you're putting work at the center of your life and living to work. So that's where that living to work thing came in. And again, the religious element had dropped out. That's why I like to call this a productivist work ethic, not a Protestant work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
It's shared among people of all different religions. Now, I should say, and I think I misspoke a minute ago, actually, the people who have what I call the diligent 9 to 5 work ethic, they're productivists too. They do think that it's, when you're working, it's not just to make money, it's also to be a good person, but unlike the people who live to work, they want boundaries on their work time. They believe you should not be lazy. They believe you should do a good job
Mm-hmm.
while you're on the clock, while you're working. But then they want that to stop. They want to be with their families. They want to, pursue their hobbies, whatever. So it's still has that moral element, but it's not like work is everything. And that group, I think that diligent 9 to 5 group gets totally overlooked. So you were talking about, when did work take over our lives and become everything? It doesn't take over most people's lives. Among my interviewees, fewer than 20% lived to work, had ever said, when they told their work histories, had ever lived to work. And many of them came to reject it. So there's this other whole group that says, yeah, it's not just about making money, it's also about being a good person, but that doesn't mean you have to make work everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
is, it makes me wonder. So if that's the case, if most people do want a 9 to 5 job, and I mean most of their lives are oriented around their families, I wonder, how do they survive? Or how, well, actually, here's a better question: how the hell do we structure our society in such a way that, collectively speaking, the people that it seems to be very black and white, where the only people that really get rewarded, I mean significantly rewarded, are the people who do overdo it, right? Where the thinking is like, well, of course, we're going to pay you this for X amount of work, and I guess this is in your contract, etc., right? But don't you want to like go above and beyond? Don't you want to do extra? So the thinking is, it's so interesting that 80% of people do want just a regular life, regular jobs, etc., but the culture is geared and created for people who are more or less entrepreneurial. How does that work?
Yeah. And this is where, I'm an anthropologist. I think culture is important, but we've also got to look at our laws and institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's just one interesting fact. Take a look at overtime pay. Okay, it the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was enacted during the Depression, mandates time and a half pay if you work more than 40 hours a week for everybody who's hourly. Now, if you get a fixed salary, there's a threshold. And if you make more than that threshold, you're exempt. You're not eligible for overtime pay. But everybody below that threshold, if you're on salary, you are eligible. So if you are below the overtime threshold and you get a salary, your boss cannot just exploit you. Your boss cannot just insinuate, hey, we've got this big projects coming up, why don't you just, stay late till we get this thing done? for no extra money. Here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're exempt, there's no extra money in that. Now, up until 1975, 60% of American workers, it was actually 62% of American workers who received a salary were eligible for overtime because the overtime threshold was set high enough to take in 62% of all the American workers who got a salary.
Mm-hmm.
Then we got these sort of pro-corporate ideologies coming in, and they stopped raising the threshold as with inflation, which meant that it kept falling behind, what the average salary was. They only raised it twice up and before the Biden administration this year. And that meant that it fell to only 15% of people who receive a salary are eligible for overtime pay. So it's not just a cultural thing. It means bosses have free reign to say, hey, stick around. We need to, you need to work late. You need to do this thing. Well, if you want to keep your job, you have to do it. It doesn't mean work is central to your life, that you love doing that. I talked to a lot of people who were really unhappy about being exploited in this way. But
Yeah.
we could just, this is actually an argument I'm making politically, because when Donald Trump was president, he appointed secretaries of labor. This is all up to the Department of Labor. This is something the president has a lot of control over. Who do they appoint as Secretary of Labor? He appointed, his first choice for Secretary of Labor was totally skeptical about overtime pay, about minimum wage laws, and he just wasn't going to raise the threshold. And then that nomination went down in flames. And then they picked somebody else who kind of slow walked it and eventually raised it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Biden has picked his first labor secretary, Marty Walsh, started a process where now it's he raised it up into the 40,000s, and now starting next year it'll be in the 50,000s. It should actually be up closer to 80,000. It should be much higher than it is, but you can't do that all at once. So it's starting a process of moving it up. So this is the long answer to your question, that this is not just a cultural thing. There have been actual political decisions that have been made that force people to work more than they want to work.
Right. Yeah, and then we can even think about it in terms of just freelance work. I mean, that a lot of contracts are pretty much either part-time and freelance. So, in terms of your interviews and people who you've talked to, can you, if there's any insight here, can you give us an understanding of what it's like for people now that the kind of structure of even work and the, what would you call it? Not just the hours, but the sort of the titles that people would have has been sort of changed, and especially since the pandemic, it's been shifted.
Well, what kind of, all right, I'm trying to think. We've got freelance work, and that's really important. We've got people who are independent workers.
Yeah.
But what did you have in mind when you're talking about titles? And
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, what have you heard from people in terms of the shift from, let's say, just being a full-time employee to obviously something that is more part-time, where they have to work a few different jobs, people being freelancers, people being contracted workers, etc.
right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a major shift. This is a really important shift. I mean, I was really interested to see when McKinsey did a survey of what they call independent workers. So
Hmm.
people who, are not have a standard employment contract.
Mm-hmm.
So freelancers, gig workers, right? That in 2016, they found 27% of US workers were independent workers. By 2022, it was 36% of
Yeah.
US workers are independent workers. And there was also a shift in that time from people who had that as a secondary job,
Hmm.
doing rideshare on the side, to that being your primary income, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, and to a certain extent, so I think when the way you were phrasing the question, it's yes, to a certain extent, it's coming from the employers.
Hmm.
It's cheaper for them, right? To kind of have these people, it's easier to drop. Uh, but it's also coming from workers themselves who
Mm.
want more flexibility, right? I mean, I you can make your own hours, right? You know, if you're a gig worker, a freelance worker, you know, most contract workers, you can make your own hours. Some temp workers, you have to do whatever, you know, the job you're filling in for. But
Mhm.
some of these other kinds of precarious work, yeah, it's precarious. You don't have a fixed income, but you make your time's your own, your schedule's your own. And you know, so to a certain extent, it's also a choice people are making. I want to have more control over my schedule.
Ooh, can I ask you then, I guess a pointed question going into now 9 to 5 workers, right? So if we agree that most people, like 80% of people, do want a 9 to 5 job, right? How does that now fit in with the gig economy and hustle culture, right? So like, how do we kind of see the numbers? Do they tend to fluctuate, or have they fluctuated over the years? And pretty much the question is, have people really bought into the hustle culture more so than they have before?
Yeah, I mean, see, the hustle culture has different meanings depending on whether you're working for yourself. You know, are you working for somebody else? Are you an entrepreneur? Uh, and the 9 to 5 thing also, it's when I say 9 to 5, that just means some kind of fixed boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right? Okay. Okay. So the people I was talking to, keep in mind, this is pre-pandemic when I did my research, you know. So I'm not going to pretend that I did my research after the pandemic. I did
Of
it
course,
before
of
the
course.
research, but before the pandemic, but obviously I read, you know, so um I think I really think that that's an illusion to think that most Americans buy into hustle culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think we get that illusion because people who comment, you know, people like me who are professors, journalists, people make a living from going out there and commenting on these trends.
Mhm.
We see other people like us, and we see people like us who do, you know, we're more, I'm this way, I'm more of the live to work type, you know. So it is central to my life. That's what I do with my vacation time.
Mm.
That's, you know, so we see other people like us. We don't see most of the people. And so it's uh okay. Now, if you are in this majority that I'm finding from my research who who totally reject this hustle culture, and they would say things like, you know, I'd ask people, would you say your work is central in your identity? And they'd think about that and say, no, I wouldn't say that. I'm a good worker. I do a
Mm-hmm.
good job, but I wouldn't say it's the most important thing to me. No, they would reject that. Um, so uh, I think I kind of suspect that's always been the majority. You know, if you're an entrepreneur, you know, hustle culture makes sense if the business is your own. If
Mm-hmm.
by putting in more hours, you'll make more money and have a more successful business. Sure, that makes sense. You can understand that. Um, but I think the majority of people want don't want that. You know, they want to do a good job, you know, and then have time for other things. Now, there are two ways you can pursue that. You can get a 9 to 5 job where they're with fixed hours,
Mhm.
or you could be an independent worker where you make your own hours. So these trends are sort of orthogonal. You know, the gig economy does, you know, I mean, it just because you are a gig worker or a freelancer, you could have either of these orientations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you find that in your research, I mean, did you find that even though there were people who, let's say, they didn't identify, right, with their work, right? They were happy to just work, you know, have certain sets of boundaries, right? Did you find that there were people who wished for more meaningful work in your interviews? In terms of, like, you know, if they had a choice, like, oh, okay, I wish it was just more meaningful, like what I'm doing. I'll do it. I'll do what I have to do, but I need something that you know, I mean, I would love something that, you know, makes me excited every day.
Yeah.
I really want to dispel a misconception that can come up here. Because
Yeah.
when I talk about diligent 9 to 5, that doesn't mean these are quiet quitters. It doesn't mean people who don't enjoy their jobs. I had this amazing finding. 30% of the people I interviewed said their job was fun.
Mm.
Huh. Okay.
They enjoyed it.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean they found it deeply meaningful. That's different. Okay. All right. So people, what did people find fun? They might enjoy the tasks themselves. So they might enjoy, I mean, like I interviewed a young man where he had this temp job building race courses for extreme sports.
Mm.
And, you know, it was tangible work outside. He'd been an athlete in high school and he just loved getting out there and building these mud walls and things. And yeah, he could see what he had done at the end of the day. It was all very tangible. He loved it. And he said that was fun. I interviewed an administrative assistant who loved uh, dealing with Microsoft Office products. She said, she loved the intellectual challenge of figuring out Excel spreadsheets.
Mm.
Um, and she said that was fun.
Mhm.
So these are not people who see work as drudgery. They're enjoying their job. Or other people who maybe they didn't mention the task so much, but they enjoyed hanging out with and chatting with their coworkers.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
That was
Yeah.
part of what they enjoyed. So I'm going to totally reject the assumption here that just because you have a diligent 9 to 5 work ethic, you don't really like your job. You
Mm.
can enjoy it. But that's not the same as seeing it deeply meaningful. And I really kind of want to explode this whole idea that the only really good job is one where you see it as a calling and you're passionate about it and you're doing great things in the world. You know, some people felt they were, but a lot of people, that wasn't necessary for them to enjoy the work, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like we create these unrealistic expectations. The only good job is one you truly love. You know, if you love your work, you won't work a day in your life, all these sayings, right? I think that's really such a high bar that you have to love your work. A lot of the people I talk to have found what I call a good enough occupation.
Mm.
You know, it wasn't bad work. They liked it. It wasn't, they didn't feel they were doing bad things in the world. I mean, some people had been in jobs where they felt like, I am making the world worse. And
Mm.
they hated that and they got out of that. Yeah, that was, or they were in really bad jobs because they were toxic work office, you know, relationships. They were being harassed. You know, there were some things like that where there were some really bad jobs. But now people who had this good enough occupation, they didn't identify with it. They wouldn't say it was deeply meaningful, but they liked it, you know, and you can make a good life that way.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I think this is I know part of what you guys are up to with this podcast is sort of advice for people, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And this is a piece of advice I have. And you know, when I talk to people about my findings, I was talking to somebody who had just earned his doctorate. And I was saying, you know, well, you don't have to get a job you love that you're passionate about. You can get a good enough job. And it really helped him to think about it that way. It made it much more attainable that you can have, you know, feel good about what you're doing. And then again, it gets back between that dichotomy you started with, you know, work. Oh, is it soul sucking? Right.
Mhm.
And, you
Mhm.
know, it's just we're helping the owners of capital exploit us and right versus you know, hustle. I love my job. You know, I'll spend, you know,
Yeah,
18
my
hours
favorite
a
day
day
is
on.
Monday. Yeah,
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
You know, most people are in the middle,
yeah.
and
Yep.
you can have a very good life in the middle.
Yep.
I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, no, I'm happy because honestly, yeah, there is a lot of that going around, right? Like, oh, you need to find work that's your calling, that's it's what you're meant for, that kind of thing. But I really like what you said. Like, yeah, if you lower that expectation, right? Don't set an unrealistic expectation. Like, you can have a good enough situation. Like, good sometimes good enough is good enough, and that's the best that you're gonna get as well, right? So honestly, I mean. I think that's a great perspective. What do you think?
Can I actually challenge you a
You're
little
gonna
bit?
challenge
A
me?
little
Ah,
bit, a little bit, a little
Wow.
bit, a little bit. So I'm a sort of a no, but I'll leave it open to exploration, right? So I'll ask you this. Okay. So what do you think? Okay, no, let me ask it this way. So do you think in any way, because I want to make sure I'm not sort of
Be
I don't wanna
careful.
lead you. I don't want to lead you into anything saying anything that you regret. But do you feel like in any way, right? Okay, let me ask you this question, right? Do you feel like for people who do, let's say people who have meaningful jobs, right? Let me make it a broad question. Do you feel like people who have meaningful jobs, do you feel like they have an extensive focus on their hobbies? Or do you think for the most part, if they found meaning, purpose, whatever in their work, right? Like let's say something like a podcast or some addition to their lives, right? It wouldn't be so important.
That
Let's
sounds so foreign to me. I never thought of that. No, no, no. I mean, so the thing is, so I guess it just depends sort of on your temperament
Mhm.
and your tastes, right? I
Right.
mean, if for example, like we do a podcast,
Yeah.
right? Okay, right. And also we happen to have also day jobs,
Right.
right, as well. So I mean, we could just choose to do our day jobs, but we like doing this as well, right? There are people, I'm sure there's a certain segment of the population who I mean, this has got to be a broad spectrum as well. There's not just people who have a meaningful job. Sometimes they look for meaning in their job. Sometimes it doesn't matter to them
Right.
what the meaning is. It's just good enough. And that
Yeah.
could be most people,
Right.
right? Uh, so I guess what I guess what are you trying like
All right. I'll,
saying
I'll
like
just tell you.
I don't
Fine.
have hobbies other than
No, 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 no.
okay.
So I won't beat around the bush. So I mean, I'm kind of like a little bit, Claudia, challenging this idea of your idea of against passion in a way. Not necessarily saying that you're framing it that way. Why?
Well, that's the thing. It's not necessarily being framed that way. Because the thing is, like, we're being pretty general when you say Claudia, like
Yeah.
when you say that there are people who, let's say, have a good enough job where they enjoy the
Yeah.
activities that they're doing there. I mean, you can play semantics there
Mhm.
and say, well, if they have friends there at work, or there's that Microsoft Office
Yeah.
program that they find challenging, you can kind of spin that semantically to
That's
say
true.
they're finding meaning if you'd like.
I mean, right, which is more
Like,
like of an interpretation, right? But what I'm really saying is, at least from what I hear from people, is like the reason why they do these hobbies, like more or less extensively, where it's not just something that you do every once in a while, like a podcast. The reason is because I mean they don't find too much meaning in their work, and so when they think about their day to day, they think like, what is this for? What am I actually contributing to the world, etc. Right? So that's why I didn't want to put you in a position where you were going to say something again on air that you might have regretted. But what I'm ultimately saying, excluding Alan, is there are certainly people out in the world that think, okay, meaning is actually super important to me. And so, just to be fair, I mean, I love your interpretation of this. And obviously, most people are not going to have these phenomenal jobs that they wake up every day thinking, oh my God, I love doing this, right? But what I'm ultimately saying is, I still think, like, especially in this country, that there's a significant deficit of meaning. And I mean, we can say that, sure, you can reframe it, but I still think that that might be really important to people.
Can I just say, I'm
Sure.
sorry, I'm so sorry. I have to say this. So, I mean, yeah, but like I mean, your question is framed in the context of work, right?
Yes.
I understand why,
Yeah.
because that is your almost every day. If for most people, 5 days of the week,
Right.
right? Generally speaking. Okay, I get it. However, there can be other things they do in their day. Like again, like those, let's say the people who are working 9 to 5, they have other segment of their day and
Sure.
their weekend where they could be making that meaning too.
Well, that's right. That's actually my point. We're agreeing. I'm saying that's why like they do these hobbies and these podcasts
Fair
and
enough.
whatnot. Right, right, right.
Sorry.
So I mean, just I'll
well,
let Claudia respond. Yeah.
that was really interesting. Uh, I'm not opposed to finding meaning in your job, and I agree. There are people who really do. It's not just this work is okay. It's sort of below that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Um, so I mean, I personally, I feel very lucky with my job. I'm a professor, and I'm at a good school with great students, and I have the chance to, do research I enjoy doing. And so I think it's wonderful. If you can find something like that, that's great. What I'm opposed to is saying that you have to do that, or if you don't have some kind of job that's deeply meaningful or that you're really passionate about, then you're condemned to the other end of, oh, I hate my job.
Mm-hmm.
I really wish I could be spending my time doing something else. Um, so, because there's so many people in the middle. One thing that bugs me a lot are the Gallup work engagement statistics. I don't know if you're familiar with this. They do this every year. They survey employees, do a representative sample of employees, to see how, it can be framed different ways. It gets reported as how engaged are the employees with their job, although they also put in terms of how good a workplace is this. The questions are things like, do you get a chance to do what you do best every day? Are all your colleagues putting forth their best effort? It's all in these superlatives. Now, they have three categories. Their top category they call engaged.
Mm-hmm.
Their bottom category they call disengaged. And then they have a big category in the middle. I mean, what they actually find is, even with those superlatives, which I think is kind of unrealistic, I get a chance to do what I do best every day. How many jobs can you say that about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I have a best friend at work. For the people I talk to, you don't have to have a best friend at work. You just need to have friendly relationships, people you can
Mm-hmm.
chat with. Okay. But even with those superlatives, they actually found between 30 and 35% of the people they talk to would say, yeah, that characterizes my job. But then they spin that because they call that top group engaged. They could call it very engaged, but they call it engaged. And then everybody else, then that'll get spun as, oh, look, we've got 70% of the workforce that's not engaged.
Mm.
Well, it's between like 16 and 20% that's actively disengaged, that has that, I hate my job, I can't wait to get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is in the middle.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we have as much of an crisis of engagement. Now, could things be better? This is what you're getting at, right? Could
Mm-hmm.
things be better? Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Things could be better. There's so much you can do to make jobs better for people. And that's another one of my points. We talk so much about people's work ethics,
Mm-hmm.
but the way you feel about your job depends on the particulars of the job.
Mm-hmm.
What's your boss like, right? Right? What are the coworkers like? What do you spend your time doing? It's not so much a general work ethic. You have that too, but that's so abstract. It's your attitude about that particular job.
Mm.
Yeah, and I also wonder if it's more or less of a dispositional issue where, like, some people, maybe again, it's my small sample of people who I'm speaking to, but that small sample seems to really care about meaning and work. So I guess I just wonder if it's more of a character or dispositional issue, or if it's, again, the problem with the actual jobs. Probably some combination of the two, as most things are.
I mean, you are a therapist.
Okay.
So, I mean, if people are coming to see you, I mean, that you are going to get.
So, Alan,
I understand
I
this is
didn't want to
reflective.
call anybody out, but there are other people that I know that happen to complain about their jobs too.
I currently am not. I am totally. I'm in the good enough space right now.
Okay.
Are you? That's good.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Uh,
really good.
but I'm sorry. Where were you?
No, but that's kind of my point. I was just wondering. I guess, whatever, spitballing or trying to kind of figure out, like, what is what is the actual problem, right? Because, like, in New York here, and maybe we can talk about this too, right? In New York, because it's super. I can't really speak to other states because obviously I'm not from them. But mostly here, it's so competitive that ultimately, like, for the people who do work here, I mean, even people who are higher up the chain, like where they're doctors, lawyers, etc. A lot of times they're settling for the scraps of their profession because of the competition here. So then again, I wonder, like, for people who are coming into these fields looking for meaning, what do we do with them when employers pretty much are like, well, take it or leave it?
Yeah. I mean, right. I don't know at that level of doctors and lawyers what the labor market is right now. I mean, at the moment, at other levels where workers have a bit of an advantage right now,
Mm,
there is a bit of a labor shortage, but maybe not at the higher professional levels. Yeah. I mean, um, that's where I start thinking politically, what can we organize to, how can we make jobs better for people? And thinking also in terms of uh, so that I have a job where, you talked about being a moral masochist. There's also the term self-exploit. I mean, I exploit myself. I work long hours. I will, if I have some stupid committee report to do, I will work weekends to get the stupid committee report done
hmm
because I have that kind of sense of responsibility.
hmm
But there's some things we can do to create more structures. Like the United States is the only wealthy industrialized society that doesn't mandate vacation pay,
hmm
right?
Yep.
Or even unpaid vacations. Is we have no mandates around vacations. And so I think people would get more joy if they weren't being forced to work such long hours and forced to work all the time. So
hmm
I really want to look not just, so if you're a therapist,
hmm
right, we it's a tendency to look inward. What is it about people's attitudes?
Yeah.
But we also have to look outwards at these structures that are
Yeah.
making a difference.
Yeah, and sometimes also people admonish themselves where they're really unhappy at a position, at a job, whatever, and they tell themselves, "Well, I should be grateful." So it's like they talk to you about it and they say, "Well, here are my complaints, etc." And then they say, "Oh man, but I can't keep saying that. I should be grateful. They got to have a job at a certain period. There's a recession going on, whatever it is, right?" And again, it's sort of like I don't want to use it because I hated this pop psychology term where it's like you gaslight yourself. So it's not exactly that. I don't want to go that far, but it's ultimately like you're kind of like pushing yourself to be better, right? There's that moral masochism, right? It's like you have a job, you have a duty, be better, do better.
Hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, and something else I sort of wanted to bring up. So we're talking a lot about people who are currently working,
Yeah.
right? But in your book you also explore people who were unemployed and their accounts there. There's an account, and actually I have it written down. I prepared this question. So Isabel Navarro, for example,
Mm.
there's an account of her. And for instance, she rejected government aid while navigating unemployment despite her financial struggles. What I wanted to ask is how do class and cultural background influence people's decisions about seeking assistance and their self perception during unemployment?
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is you've got different sources of assistance. So
Right.
you were particularly referring to government assistance, right?
Yeah, like Medicaid
Right.
or
Yeah.
food
So
stamps. Yeah.
right, and she rejected government assistance, which was very typical of the immigrants among my participants, whether they were documented or undocumented. She was documented. Uh, there was part of their self-perception is, I didn't come here to take this money from the government. I came here to work,
Right.
right? I'm not going to do that. But there were other options, like their church. Can you get money? Or it's your faith groups. Can they
Hmm.
help you out? What about relationships? She actually made a decision to live with a boyfriend that she wouldn't have lived with him if
Mm,
she had a job and made an income. There was another woman I talked to, Renee McKnight,
Hmm.
where her self-respect was the opposite. She was not going to depend on any man. She was not going to exploit some man, in a relationship just to get supported.
mm,
So she did get temporary aid for needy families. She had a teenage daughters. It was a pittance, didn't even pay her rent. But so people do make different decisions about that. Who are you going to turn to? Family. I mean, the kinship relationship, it's so interesting in the United States, and things are changing. So in the US, we have the mainstream expectation is parents support their children, even their adult children, you know, grow adult children in their 20s, 30s, 40s
Mhm.
are not expected to support their parents.
Mhm.
Now, if your parents really struggling, probably you'll feel some compulsion, to help them out.
Of
But
course.
there's no general social expectation that even when you're all grown up, you help your parents, but you do expect your parents at whatever age, they could be 60 and you're 40, they could be 70 and you're 50, whatever. You still expect them to help you.
Mhm.
Anyway, so in addition to the government, there are a lot of other places to turn to for help, right? So
Yeah.
and you asked about culture. So there were some cultural patterns about that, so that's where I said the immigrants, most of whom were from Latin America, were not turning to the government. They were turning to family, they were turning to church, right?
Yeah.
And funny enough, I mean, from one side, I truly I respect that mentality, at least in Isabel's case, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I get it. I get it. No, I'd like to do this either myself or with other sorts of resources. I don't want to depend on the government, you know. I got this far on my own or with whatever support I have. I don't need this other support. Respect. It's great. But from another perspective, I mean, if if someone were to take advantage of those resources, it actually I forget, and I really apologize. This is a guest we had a long time ago. I think already 2 years ago.
Mm.
We had an economist on who let us know like actually giving money to people is a good thing.
Mhm.
Like
Oh
there's
yeah.
this like
Oh, you talking Moshe Hoffman or Eric Anger?
I think Eric
Eric.
Anger.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. It was
Mhm.
Eric Anger.
Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, giving, yeah, we talked about this. Like, some people have this mentality like, oh, if you give money to people, if you make things too easy for them, they're not going to work. And
Right.
maybe there's some percentage of people that that could apply to, sure. But overall, I mean, if you're giving resources to someone, it just makes things a little bit easier for them. And then they're able to actually do and produce
Oh,
more.
let me add on to that. You
Sure.
know what's so interesting, and Claudia, I'm sure you picked up on this too. I love how on the right we have these two sort of dichotomous understandings of like the immigrant experience or the poor experience or whatever, right? On the one hand, it's they're lazy and they don't want to work. On the other hand, it's like they don't have a right to a job. So which is it, right? You have the Occupy Wall Street people from a decade plus ago saying, like, hey, we deserve to work. We have a right to this. And people say, you don't have a right to work. Who the hell are you, right? And then on the other hand, it's, oh, you're lazy. You don't want to work. How, which is it? You guys got to pick one.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There are a lot of conflicts in the discourses there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other thing, I've been interested in people's attitudes about social welfare programs for a long time. I mean, my previous book was about that.
Mhm.
And both in that project and in this project, it's not, we have different attitudes towards different programs and they change over time. So, uh, unemployment benefits, for example. Nobody gets stigmatized for taking unemployment benefits. Nobody says, oh, you're lazy, you're taking unemployment benefits, right? That's
Overall, sure.
in general.
Yeah.
Once it starts getting to be, like for the year during periods of recessions, then they get extended and then people start grumbling. Yeah,
Mhm, mhm.
right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right. It's been a year. Normally it ends either at 6 months or even some states even less than that.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. But so it depends what it is. What is the form of the assistance? Public schooling, right? I mean, there's some things, right? Pell Grants, whatever. I mean, there's some things where we say, oh, that's perfectly fine. We don't stigmatize that. The people who receive it don't see it as a problem.
Mhm.
Um, Health insurance is becoming like that, right? We're
Yeah.
not saying, hey, what's wrong with you? You're getting, help with to pay exorbitant medical bills from the
Mhm.
government, right? So these things change. What was interesting even was attitudes about something like food stamps, which sometimes are very stigmatized. What I found is just over the course of my research, which was a couple years actively, I've stayed in touch with some people, but the active period was a couple years.
Mhm.
People changed their attitudes about food stamps
Mhm.
because it's they some people I have three examples I document in the book of people who started out saying, I'm not going to take food stamps. That was like, no way, that's not me. I've never needed food stamps, never going to take food stamps.
Hmm.
They really associated that with being very poor. Well, during the Great Recession, which was when I was doing my research in the aftermath of the Great Recession, with this, again, three people looking for jobs, for every job out there, it was very hard to get a job. Actually, the rules on food stamps changed.
Hmm.
You didn't have to be the very poorest of the poor to qualify, and you could get them longer. And some of the people who had started out saying to me, never going to take food stamps, I'd be checking with them like a year later, and they said, oh, good news, I'm on food stamps now, and it helps so much.
Hmm.
Now I can afford my groceries. There were people who really, really needed that assistance, so attitudes are changeable. Something like the earned income tax credit, again, that's there's no stigma in that. So that just giving people money during the pandemic, they raised the child tax credit,
Hmm.
not stigmatized, help families a whole lot. Yeah, these experiments you're talking about, the income experiments just give people a certain amount every month. And yeah, they need it to pay rent, just basic stuff. They're not frittering away and they're still working. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah, even in my person. So at the beginning of the podcast, I was talking about how there was a year where I was unemployed.
Yeah.
At the beginning of that year, I was, and this is in my like early 20s, I was thinking, I'm not doing food stamps. I'm not doing Medicaid. I'm not doing all of this, right? Okay, well, cut to me doing it, right?
Lol.
uh, then at the very beginning, I, okay, so I was getting those benefits, and yeah, I started to see kind of like certain changes in my behavior. I mean, I didn't like really document this. I don't have, this is more anecdotal, right? But uh, what I did notice is that as I was able to, let's say, pay for food, just have just some of that supplemental income, then I wasn't in a sort of this sort of hungry survival mode where all day I'm thinking about how am I going to get out of this situation. There was a degree to which that mindset was, but I couldn't tell you how many orders of magnitude, but there was a certain level to which that mindset really dimmed down. And I was able to think in other ways by just having that sort of supplemental assistance. And so, yeah, no, these programs are definitely amazing. Is there anyone who, kind of uh, maybe for some time could abuse it and that sort of thing. Sure. I mean, I'll tell you this. I was, let's say, in the very beginning of me having food stamps, was I still just kind of going day to day, maybe, just getting the food and then relaxing at home while I had no time, no work to do, that sort of thing? Sure. But there's a time where that sort of gets old anyway. And then different kinds of thinking, starts to seep in. And so, in that sense, that's why I think those programs are successful. It could get you out of a certain level of thinking.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the research on it is, people are not like putting their feet up and frittering it away for the most part.
Yeah.
They really need it, and it's so now we can, pay for the rent, and we have to think
Hmm.
about it's what we were just talking about. If you don't be just in that bare survival, like, can I even make rent? Where am I sleeping? Right?
Hmm.
Then you can, okay, hey, maybe I could get a little training or think about a different job. Or a lot of people who qualify for some income assistance are working people.
Hmm.
Think of how low the federal minimum wage in this country, right?
Right.
For
So,
Yeah.
sure.
you know, just a little over $7 an hour. You can't live on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, no. I mean, unless you were gonna, no, just to continue on that thread. I mean, yes. Let's say someone out of college, right? I mean, I guess I'm not really too keen on what's the current average income for maybe someone in the middle of college or getting out of there. But if someone's working either a part-time or maybe full-time job in that sort of age range, and not even that age range, we could talk about other jobs too, but they're probably making what 20, anywhere from a range of like maybe 18 to maybe early 30s, like sort of per year, something like that. And if that's the case, I mean, I guess depending where you are in that range, there are many different sorts of levels of assistance that you can get, right? As far as that goes. Um, I guess in the domain of, let's say, health insurance, you could get very affordable health insurance
Hmm.
at a 30 income range or a 30K income range or lower. Even if it was higher, you could get those tax credits you were mentioning earlier, that sort of thing. And so, yeah, the I guess just to continue on this thread of these, benefits, they're amazing. They're amazing, and um, people should take advantage of them, even though that's not exactly the point of this talk.
Right.
Yeah.
But also I think again, kind of piggybacking with what I was saying before, it's like the thinking is that you have to choose. It's either people want to work or they want to write to a job. I'm sorry, they don't want to work or they want to write to a job. Because for the most part, what we're seeing is, I think, and I'm sure Claudia, you see this also in the data, is that for the most part, people don't want to be on food stamps. They don't want to have welfare. Yeah, right. They really do want to work. So my thinking is, and I don't really even understand the backlash to like, oh, everybody has a right to a job. Dude, a lot of these people are not asking for even high level corporate jobs. They're literally just asking for a job to be able to support themselves, to get off of government benefits. So I really, I don't, I mean, unless it's just pure hypocrisy, I really don't understand the thinking there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this is something, and are you talking about attitudes about immigrants in particular, or?
You know what's interesting? I was thinking about that. Yeah, that's actually what I had in mind, but I'm also going to just generalize it to anybody that's like below a certain income threshold. But yeah, I was actually thinking of immigrants.
Yeah. I mean, for immigrants in particular, this is something I found in my last research project. We actually have all these conflicting discourses going around, and a lot of the people I talk to would they'll say things like, they're coming in and just coming in and taking benefits, but then they would say, oh, but they're very hardworking. They're taking
Yeah.
the jobs nobody else wants to do, and right.
Right.
So we actually have all these conflicting discourses about it. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting. If you look back at Dr. Martin Luther King,
Mhm.
he was all in favor of full employment.
Hmm.
His famous march on Washington was a march for freedom and jobs.
Yep.
It was both.
Hmm.
Um, Now, what's interesting though, philosophically, is you do have on the left, we have this divide between those who are emphasizing full employment. There should be a good job for everybody who wants a job.
Yep.
And those are saying, wait a minute, why is everything premised on having a full time job, a good job, spending all our time working? This is what's called a post work approach.
Hmm.
So, post work activists on the left disagree with laborists. I would call people like Dr. Martin Luther King who are focusing on full employment. Those are
Hmm.
laborists, right? The post work approach is, wait a minute, why don't we really reduce how much work everybody has to do? And you could say, particularly now, if we've got intelligent machines, could do more of this work. I mean, people have been saying this for decades. We've had automation for a long time. It's just getting more and more intelligent and able to do more and more. Why don't we let the machines do more? Obviously, we have to keep people alive, but that's partly the job of the government, partly the job maybe of local groups, grassroots, people living communally, helping each other. We can imagine other kinds of economies. Um, so that I find that kind of divide very interesting,
Yeah.
philosophically, because it's not a left-right divide; it's a divide in the left.
Interesting. And so here's my question, right? Because when you talk about or when you think about sort of AI, computers or whatever systems taking over jobs, right? We often think about it as a more of a utopia where I think the thinking is like, oh, we'll just be free to do, etc. Whatever, right? But with that being said, I mean, technically, the only real people who benefit from these are like shareholders of companies, because what happens is workers get laid off, right? So when they automate these processes, and essentially you're just looking for another job. So I'm just curious, I know this isn't exactly your work, but what are your ideas about automation, and especially what are your ideas in the context of, fairness within labor and labor practices?
Yeah. And I should preface this by saying do not have the expertise to predict, will there be massive unemployment?
Yeah.
What are the effects going to be? Because there are, a lot of respectable people out there who say the future are these cobots who work with us, and make
Mhm.
the job easier. It's not necessarily going to replace. Uh, I personally don't feel too threatened by the large language models. I don't think they can do my job yet. Um, but so all right. Before I get off on that though, just repeat your question. What were you
Yeah.
asking?
So yeah, right. So what are your thoughts? I guess in terms of automation, right? What are your thoughts about how this would affect labor practices? Because again,
Oh, for
the thinking usually is like it becomes this great utopia for all of us. We have all this free time. We're able to hang out, play video games, whatever, right? But like, what?
And just to tag that,
Mhm.
I sense in your question, you're probably thinking, if a company could get away with having, let's say, some sort of AI model
Yes.
or machine do the work, wouldn't they pay somebody less
Yes.
or
Because
give
now you're
less
competing with
hours?
machines too. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So what I'm saying is, isn't there like a dark side to all of this, even though we tend to
Oh,
kind of
sure.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, of course. I mean, but again, this is really interesting how laborists and post-work theorists look at this very differently,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for laborists, this is a huge threat because if you think a good job is necessary for a good life and a good society, having everybody working, then automation is a big threat. If you're a post-work theorist, you're saying bring on the robots. This is right. And instead of why don't we have a society less oriented around paying jobs, and where there's maybe work will just take half the amount of time it takes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where these government programs, or again other kinds, it could be grassroots, other ways of organizing ourselves and making staying alive and living well, that could come up. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think for the short term, I do. If you're asking about what will labor practices and so forth for the short term, I do want to see workers as part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see labor as part of the conversation about what's happening and where we're going with this.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I just want to kind of give a quick example. So it's not exactly super relevant, but I just want to kind of get the thinking about what this could look like in connection. So there's an example of, let's say, with government funded healthcare, right? So ever since Obamacare, from my understanding, is that a lot of, not every employer, obviously, but a lot of employers would say something like, well, because, you're a contractor worker, you're freelance or whatever, you can just get a plan off the exchange, right? So ultimately, you can just pretty much, because you're going to get tax credit for it anyway, right? It's not our responsibility anymore, right? And what happens for a lot of people is they end up paying more for healthcare on the exchanges just because they are pretty expensive, even with the tax credits, than they would if, let's say, the employer were partially funding it, which is what normally happens, right? So this is what I'm kind of wondering about AI, right? Is it sort of a sleight of hand where essentially they're like, yeah, this is going to help us all. And then they're essentially pushing workers out and saying, well, you find a way to take care of yourself now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the healthcare example is one where, to my mind, it's just crazy that we don't have, something that where healthcare is affordable for everybody. I
Right.
mean, lots of other countries have figured this out, you know. So that's absolutely something we should be able to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at this moment is workers really have to take advantage of this moment of this labor market right now, and it's happening. We see organized labor stronger than it has been for decades, and it's because of supply and demand. We've got people like me, the baby boomers, who are retiring, so that reduces the number of workers and fewer young people being born. So demographically, the pool has shrunk, which gives the workers who are there more of an advantage. And that's also why we need immigrants. They are coming in, as soon as they can be given work permits, that's what's necessary. Get work permits, go out and work, and that's what's starting to happen. It's helping a lot.
Mhm.
And also they pay into Social Security, right? So they're paying into Social Security, they're help shoring up, Social Security and Medicare. So, but right now, there's a little bit of a demographic advantage for labor. And this is, it's so important to take advantage of this now to negotiate what the future is going to look like.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask something?
No, I was just thinking in the context of, like automation. I wouldn't say this is quite related, but I think it's cool that at least post COVID, it's more acceptable for people to work from home
Mm.
than it
Yeah.
ever used to be, right? And even though there is a return to the office sort of movement, depending what the work is in the context of that, I just see way more jobs totally being cool with either that hybrid sort of work idea or just completely working from home. So I feel like that's a step in the right direction in terms of um, giving people like a level of comfort, right? And at least, I mean, some people say they have different opinions uh, in terms of this working from home thing. I personally, I love it. I love it. You're not commuting. It's great. You have way more time. You could sometimes get away with doing something else maybe while you're supposed to be working. And of course you're working, but
Disclaimer.
but no. But then there is the other side to it. People who are only working from home, they're missing certain social aspects to that, or at least moving around. Maybe they're finding, I personally find I'm sitting more at like I'm less moving around
Mhm.
Mm.
as far as that goes. So I mean, but I do like this direction that we're going in as far as that goes. Maybe we'll get those 4-day work weeks, maybe 3,
I
maybe
mean, but
not.
here's
Just
now
kidding.
the idea, going back to the sense of threat, right? So, I mean, I guess I do want to hear your thoughts on this, Claudia. So, like, how do you feel about something like a 3 or 4 day work week? Again, knowing that there's a possibility that essentially employers are just going to say, hey, you want the 3 to 4 day work week? Cool. We'll just cut your salary too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where having it helps if there's fewer than one person available for every job. Where if there's a certain desperation for workers,
Yeah.
then employers have to give a little bit on that. Um, yeah, I've been really encouraged by anytime in all the experiments, companies that have experimented with 4-day work weeks. I haven't seen examples of 3-day work weeks, but I've seen examples of companies experimenting with 4-day work weeks and keeping the current salary level. And
Mm.
they find it's just as productive.
Hmm.
People are getting
Great.
just as much done
Hmm.
in their 4 days. And the teleworking, right? The productivity is not being lost. Now the hanging out with colleagues, and this was my initial reaction, because one of my findings, I think I mentioned this earlier, was one thing that could make a job fun for people was chatting with coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So my initial thought with teleworking was, oh, I wonder how people are going to like this, being cut off from their coworkers. And that's where, from what I'm reading of the studies on this, consultants looking into it, what they're finding is companies really, employers, it could be nonprofit also, have to be kind of intentional about creating other opportunities for people to socialize, if it's hybrid or entirely teleworking, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because
Okay.
that part is important.
Yep. Okay. And then as we start wrapping up, my one of my final questions is, or one of our final questions is going to be, so if you wanted, let's say if you wanted your readers to take away any particular 1 or 2 things from your book, what would that be?
I want for people, I'll throw out something both for employers to think about and people who are job seekers or thinking about changing a career.
Hmm.
Okay, right? On the employer side, I want them to keep in mind this whole category of the diligent 9 to 5 worker. somebody, they're not willing to sign their life over to the job. They want to go home at the end of the day. They would be really happy with a right to disconnect, law if we had that in the United States. But they could be someone like that administrative assistant I talked to who got fun from figuring out Excel spreadsheets. She loved her job. She did a great job. She was terrific at it. She would do those kinds of things when nobody else would. But she said at the end of the day, when 5 o'clock comes, I want to go home. Mm-hmm. Employers should be rewarding people like that, not just the people who put in a lot of face time, right? Yeah. So that's a takeaway for employers. For the job seekers, again, it's this point of what's important to you, right? We think about, what's a good life? And there are two ways of thinking about a good life: a moral life or a fun life, right? We can think about it either way. Good has both of those meanings. But what I found in my research is, you don't have to necessarily give up one for the other, right?
Right.
It's just, you could have fun and also be a good worker, but that doesn't, and you can put those things together. A lot of people I talked to had fun from their jobs, and they were good workers. They felt they were being good people too, in doing a good job and being productive. But if you can have a good life, if also you don't feel like it has to reach these unattainable, I am pursuing my, something that is so deeply meaningful to me. It's a calling, it's a passion. I never feel like I'm working a day in my life. Not realistic. Mm-hmm. If you settle for just a little bit less, you could be very happy, fulfilled. And a lot of the people I talked to were.
I love that. Yeah, and good enough is a theme that we definitely constantly, I would say, revisit on this show.
All right. That's good. I'm glad.
Yeah. All right, Alan, the final questions for Claudia before we wrap up.
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Oh, thanks for asking. Go to claudiastrauss.org.
All right. Awesome. That was simple. Awesome. Claudia, thank you so much for coming on. This was excellent. We really enjoyed it.
Oh, I really enjoyed it too. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
That was great. So again, everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.